Welcome to Cineights, where you get to know the best movies and series. Today's video is about the best vampire movies. Be sure to watch until the end. Please subscribe to the channel and like the video. Twilight 2008. Some of you may scorn and jest at seeing the first installment of the supernatural franchise on a list such as this, but Catherine Hardwicke's moody, melancholy adaptation of Stephenie Meyer's novel is the best of the sparkly-skinned bunch. We reckon that Twilight deserves to claw its way into this list because of its cultural impact alone, but there's more to it than that. The blue-tinged aesthetic evokes rain-soaked forks perfectly, the soundtrack is full of winners, and Kristen Stewart and Robert Pattinson's two lead performances were the foundation from which the actors have since built incredibly interesting, compelling filmographies. Twilight completely captures the intense longing and inherent relationship drama that makes beautiful young bloodsuckers such a ripe source of inspiration for ya stories, and, you have to admit it, that supermassive black hole baseball scene is pretty damn good. Night 2014. Generally speaking, you'd have to say there aren't that many black and white, Farsi language, nouvelle vague, punk vampire western romances, but on the evidence of a girl walks home alone at night, there should probably be more. Iranian-American writer and director Anna Lily Amirpour expands her 2011 short of the same name, and keeps the central sly conceit of the title we're used to girls walking home alone at night in horror films being vulnerable, but here, that describes the threat. The girl's chador, often thought of as a symbol of oppression in a culture that requires women to cover themselves, here becomes one of power. It allows her to pass unnoticed while simultaneously throwing an iconic silhouette, and it hides, hilariously, a stolen skateboard, the means by which she glides eerily through the monochrome streets of the fictional Iranian Bad City. Great soundtrack, too. You can tell that Amirpour is also a DJ. It's a strange film, and possibly an exercise in style over substance. Only Lovers Left Alive 2013. After a western, a couple of gangster films and a sort of rom-com, Only Lovers Left Alive finally saw idiosyncratic indie legend Jim Jarmusch turn his attention to horror. Not that the film is scary, exactly, but it is about vampires, and bursts of startling violence occasionally punctuate the stoned and laconic comedy. The film takes place in two-decade city's Detroit, where the reclusive Adam makes dark music in a dismal apartment, and Tangier, where Adam's wife of centuries Eve, drags him for, if not some sunshine, then at least a change of air. Undeniably pretentious, it's also a weirdly cheerful film beneath its put-on gloom. Most of its characters are suffering existential ennui, but Eve remains a source of tremendous positivity. "How can you live so long and still not get it?" she says to Adam in exasperation. This self-obsession is a waste of living. It could be spent in surviving things, appreciating nature, nurturing kindness and friendship, and dancing. Ganja and Hess 1973. When executives gave director Bill Gunn the financing to make Ganja and Hess, they were expecting a blaxploitation vampire flick in the Blackula mold. Instead, they got something much more meditative and often melancholic, an experimental moodpiece that reconfigures vampiric blood hunger as an addiction. An addiction to what? There are many interpretations. Night of the Living Dead's Dwayne Jones stars as Dr. Hess Green, a well-off black anthropologist researching Africa's ancient Mithrian nation and its culture of drinking blood. Then, his assistant George Meta stabs him with a ceremonial dagger before taking his own life, and Hess' own bloodlust begins, complicated by Meta's wife Ganja turning up in search of her disappeared husband. Byzantium 2013. Not the only Neil Jordan joint on this list, Byzantium is a more modern, more realist take on the vampire genre. It stars Gemma Arterton and Saoirse Ronan as Clara and Eleanor, a blood-sucking mother and daughter duo who have been on the run from the Brotherhood, an order of male vampires, for 200 years. They try to settle in that most evocative of settings, an English seaside town, and find ways to feed that ever-present hunger. Eleanor seeks out people who don't want to live, whilst Clara preys on those who deserve to die. There are period flashbacks, but this is no Interview with the Vampire, Jordan's classic from almost 20 years previously. Byzantium is an altogether more cold, brutal piece, but with a stellar performance from a young Ronan, lush bloody imagery and an interesting exploration of a dynamic we don't normally see in these movies. It's just as deserving of its spot in the Vampire Movie Hall of Fame as its director's earlier, masterful attempt. Thirst 2009. Thirst is an odd beast, a Korean horror film based on a 19th-century French novel that has no supernatural elements. That novel, Émile Zola's Thérèse Raquin, involves the eponymous orphan heroine being railroaded into an unhappy marriage by her overbearing aunt, Madame Raquin. Chained to the feeble Camille, Therese begins a torrid affair with the dashing Laurent, but its future is not a happy one, and there's murder afoot. In Park Chan-wook's hands, Laurent is recently turned vampire Sang Yun, Therese is Tae Ju, and Camille is Kong Woo, and the already complicated plot is further twisted by Sang Yun's need to cope with his blood cravings and the consequences of his vampirizing others. Zola belonged to the naturalist school, so it's safe to say he'd have been surprised by the sight of any of his characters catching fire in the sunlight. But for all its skew-whiff take on the material, Thirst hews oddly faithfully to its source. Cronos 1993. Guillermo del Toro's Spanish-language debut immediately announced him as a talent to watch. The playfully morbid story revolves around Federico Lupi's crumbling antiques dealer, who accidentally comes into possession of the mysterious Cronos device, and finds it returning his old youthful vim and vigor. But of course, there's a price. Plot-wise, then, it's unremarkable, but the 29-year-old Del Toro here already displays his feel for character and his eye for lavish and intricate design. The budget can't have been high, but the writer-director still manages to conjure a convincing 16th-century prologue from his limited resources. The makeup designs and brass and clockwork of the Cronos itself would remain as recognizable Del Toro signatures in the generally extraordinary projects that followed. A fully formed debut, Cronos walks the line between classy and pulpy, and it's a line that Del Toro has effortlessly balanced on ever since. Fright Night 1985. Preempting Buffy and her imitators by more than a decade, Fright Night took the John Hughes-style teen high school drama and threw monsters at it. The result was, and remains, kind of delightful, with the likable William Ragsdale coming to suspect that his neighbor Chris Sarandon is among the unliving, and has designs on his girlfriend. His solution? Call his favorite late-night TV horror host, the semi-recumbent Roddy McDowall, into action. It's dated less well than some of its contemporaries, and Stephen Jeffries' Evil Ed was always annoying, but Fright Night remains a heartfelt love letter to classic horror, a nostalgic favorite that's now a classic in its own right. Blade 1998. Stephen Norrington came out of special effects departments, directed one straight-to-video knockoff and one cinematic masterpiece, and then crashed and burned with the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen and was never heard from again. But thankfully, we'll always have Blade, the first modern Marvel movie, predating even X-Men. It's a violent, techno-soundtracked collision of genres, gifting Wesley Snipes the role he was born to play, the always pissed-off half-vampire vigilante daywalker. And the casting of Stephen Dorff as the villain was sort of genius, too. Blade is action-packed, pacey, unbelievably cool, surprisingly gnarly, and, in a detail that people sometimes miss when they're trying to sound clever, it knows it's funny. Anyone who watched Snipes posing with his sword and thought the film was unintentionally amusing just didn't get it at all. Guillermo del Toro's Blade 2 is excellent too, stripping out the comic book superhero elements like the car and the obvious costume and leaning more directly into the horror aspects. From Dusk Till Dawn 1996, a priest, his kids and two gangsters walk into a bar. It sounds like a joke and it is. Perhaps one of the most uproarious vampire movies of them all. From Dusk Till Dawn is the joint progeny of Quentin Tarantino and Robert Rodriguez, and spins on the fantastic rug pull of completely changing genre halfway through. To start with, it feels like Tarantino by numbers. Reservoir Dogs on the road. But once we reach the titty twister, all bets are off. George Clooney clearly has a blast playing against type as an amoral killer. Harvey Keitel also gets to mix it up as a man of peace who reluctantly becomes a man of undead war, and Salma Hayek performs the sexiest snake dance ever as the wonderfully named Santanica Pandemonium. There are sterling turns from Juliette Lewis, Fred Williamson, Cheech Marin, Danny Trejo, Michael Parks, John Saxon and Tom Savini too, and by the end it's utter carnage. The Lost Boys 1987, 35 years old and a cultural touchstone for the generations that have grown up with it. What else could top Empire's vampire list but The Lost Boys? Joel Schumacher's best film is a multi-genre piece that transcends all of its potential limitations. It's a teen movie, but doesn't skimp on violence and viscera. It's a horror film, but it's genuinely funny. It's a comedy, but it's properly scary. You can pick your chosen pack too. Maybe you loved Corey Haim and the Frog Brothers, or maybe you'd have secretly preferred to hang out with Kiefer Sutherland, Alex Winter and the rest of their edgier, older clan. Unlike Fright Night, released the same year, it uses the tropes of the established vampire genre without being backwards-looking or nostalgic, and while it's definitely a time capsule, it hasn't dated as badly as it could have, although Tim Capello, the oiled-up, half-naked saxophone player, has received some amused attention from the meme sphere in recent years. Nosferatu 1922 denied the rights to Bram Stoker's novel. F.W. Murnau turned Dracula into Count Orlik. Played by theater actor Max Schreck in astonishing makeup, the character conveys an almost indescribable malevolence. Famous subsequent Draculas like Bela Lugosi and Christopher Lee would put their own alluring spin on the character. but here he's just a filthy, corrosive evil, creeping through Murnau's expressionist shadows. Nosferatu's German subtitle is a symphony of horror, an odd claim for a silent film, but somehow you can't argue with it. Bootleg Dracula it may be, but it remains a touchstone for every subsequent adaptation, and it's still this film that Oxford World's Classics use for their paperback Dracula cover. Dracula 1958, Quatermass and Frankenstein preceded it, but to a great extent, Hammer horror begins here. Directed by the incomparable Terence Fisher, written by Jimmy Sangster, pairing Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, and going all out with color, glamour, sex and blood, Hammer's Dracula aligns the elements and distills the formula that powered the studio for the next 2 decades. Sangster's bold screenplay at once eviscerates Bram Stoker's novel and sets the narrative free. With the locations transposed and limited to Romania and half the dramatis personae excised, we're left with a lean adventure, kicked off by the conceit that Jonathan Harker in this version is a spy for Cushing's swashbuckling Van Helsing. Lee, of course, gets to be urbane and darkly seductive, but there's also genuine savagery to the moments when he gets to bare his teeth. There would be further great Hammer vampire movies: Kiss of the Vampire, Brides of Dracula, Twins of Evil, but Dracula is where the studio that dripped blood really found its gothic groove. Near Dark 1987, a vampire romance from a time before that phrase became horrifying. Catherine Bigelow's Near Dark centers on star-crossed lovers Adrian Pasdar and Jenny Wright. The pair meet in seemingly unremarkable circumstances, but their impromptu tryst leaves Pasdar smoking as the sun rises and forced to go on the run through the Oklahoma landscape with Wright's vampire clan, the Aliens representative company of Bill Paxton, Jeanette Goldstein and Lance Henriksen. Everyone's great, but as ever, it's Lance Henriksen that draws the eye as Jesse, the craggy patriarch who, in case you hadn't noticed that this is a Western, is old enough to be an American Civil War veteran. Action-packed, scary, beautifully shot and genuinely romantic, it's one of the absolute nailed-on classics of the vampire genre, and it arrived within months of The Lost Boys in 1987. Let the Right One in 2008, well before The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo and the explosion of Scandi-noir that followed. Let the Right One in demonstrated that the Swedes were already well ahead in the dark genre game. A breakout international sensation, Tomas Alfredson's adaptation of John Ajvide Lindqvist's novel is a tale of childhood innocence and experience, as bullied Stockholm schoolboy Oscar takes up with ambiguous vampire Eli and discovers the lasting consequences. The film negotiates a fine balance between rather sweet childhood relationship story and something far more disturbing. Eli, after all, is far older than any normal kid. Thematically, it also takes in love and loneliness, class politics and aging, but its off-kilter strangeness and moments of shocking violence keep its horror credentials to the fore. Reeves' American remake, Let Me In, is decent too, although it files off some of Swedish version's rougher edges. Interview with the Vampire 1994, Anne Rice's novels are so cinematic that it's curious she hasn't been adapted more often, but Neil Jordan certainly set the bar of quality high in 1994. Interview with the Vampire, adapting the first of Raya's Vampire Chronicles, is lush, sensuous, grown-up filmmaking, tapping the same vein as both Jordan's 1984 masterpiece The Company of Wolves and the aforementioned Byzantium. Intriguingly, there are almost no ordinary humans in Interview, with the exception of Christian Slater's journalist in the actual interview sequences. This is the night-to-night grind of the undead, more focused on petty internecine squabbles than it is on overblown gothic. The casting controversies at the time were a distraction. Brad Pitt as Lewis and Tom Cruise as Lestat are both great in their roles, Cruise especially, playing against type for more or less the first time, leaning into some of the darker aspects of his movie star persona that he'd later also exploit for Magnolia and Collateral.